morning, everybody, and welcome to this year's Young Teachers Conference. Thank you all for joining in, and also thanks for bearing with us as we have changed from in-person to virtual and because of the rail strike. So thank you very much for bearing with us. So this is one of the first workshops, and we're very honoured to have Lee Gale with us this morning, who is going to talk to us around trans awareness, trans identity. So Lee has worked with the NASUWT for a number of years, and we're really proud of the relationship that we have with gendered intelligence. Lee has joined gendered intelligence since 2013, and he's worked in support of trans communities in a range of voluntary roles and organisations since 2000. He's delivered gendered intelligence training sessions, presentations, consultations throughout the UK from all sectors, whether it's commercial, statutory, not-for-profit, and across many disciplines. So we see that Lee has a wide range of expertise on this particular subject. So he's also done training the trainers, and I've been very lucky to have done one of his sessions. So it's excellent. So Lee, you're very welcome. Perhaps I should have said, because I haven't got it written here, my name is Jennifer Moses, and I'm the national official for the NASUWT. My preferred pronouns are she and her. So over to you, Lee.
Thanks, Jennifer. It's great to see you again. And yeah, just amazing work to transfer this all to remote in the last couple of days. So I'm just going to share my screen so you can see my presentation. So yeah, already had a lovely introduction. So that's me. And I'm just going to go through a little bit about GI and what to expect from the session, and then we'll go through some slides. And there is lots of opportunity to ask questions at the end of the session as well. So we've got about 15-20 minutes for questions. If you want to submit a question, then you can use the kind of submit question thing, and that will come through, and I'll pick those out at the end of the session. So for those of you who aren't familiar with us, I'm from an organisation called Gendered Intelligence, and we're a UK-based organisation working across, as Jennifer said, lots of different organisations across the UK, and of course now through the power of Zoom and remote working, reaching a wider audience more internationally as well a little bit now. So we've been around since 2008, and we're now a registered charity. And our aims as a charity are to increase understanding of gender diversity and to improve trans people's quality of life. And we imagine a world where people are no longer constrained by narrow perceptions and expectations of gender, and where diverse gender expressions are visible and valued. So although we do focus a lot on our work around trans inclusion, trans awareness, we also recognize that, you know, when we think about expectations of gender, those narrow perceptions of gender, understanding gender diversity in both of those statements, that doesn't just impact on trans people. So thinking much more widely than that, and thinking about how everyone can become more intelligent about gender, how we can continue our own learning and understanding, as well as just recognizing how quickly things are changing in the world as well. So starting from the very basics, what do we mean by this term trans? And it's a broad definition. You know, whenever we get a word that's supposed to encompass a whole kind of community, we recognize that that community isn't just one group of people that has exactly the same need. But very generally, thinking about people who feel that the sex they're assigned at birth doesn't match easily or sit easily with their sense of self, so their gender identity. And people may use the term trans to describe themselves. And of course, people will relate to this in all sorts of different ways, whether it's the language they use, the experience they feel they have, what that means to them. And this is sometimes what can make that feel quite overwhelming to people. It's a wide range of different experiences. Because people will relate to that in lots of different ways, it can feel quite complex a topic. And the way that I simplify that is to think about how do I support that person that I'm working alongside? it doesn't matter what all of the possibilities might be in terms of how people relate to it, the language they use, how they relate to that language. What matters is what's right for that individual. So don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to engage with the person and find out what's right for them and how you can best support them. So in terms of the first little bit of good practice, just thinking about asking those questions. Now, questions can be both really, really important, but also incredibly inappropriate and intrusive. So before I ask a question, I will first of all think about, why am I asking that question? Who is it going to benefit? Is it to benefit me and my own learning or understanding? Or is it to benefit the person that I'm working alongside? So don't be afraid to ask. Just think about, who is it you're asking for and why are you asking that question? So as I say, it could be a wide range of different experiences that people might have, including but not limited to the following. So people might be assigned female at birth and recognize themselves to be a boy or a man. So may describe themselves as a trans boy, a trans man, or just as a boy or as a man, maybe with a trans history. And likewise, somebody might be assigned male at birth and recognizes themselves to be a girl or a woman. Again, might describe themselves as a trans girl, trans woman, woman with a trans history, girl with trans experience. But there are other ways of understanding gender as well. So people might recognize their gender as beyond this concept, this binary of man or woman, or in between those, or have another sense of gender and may describe themselves as non-binary. And other people might feel that their gender is more fluid. So their experience of gender might change depending on the context, who they're with, where they're at, how they're feeling, their sense of self. And it might change because of their sense of self, but it might also change because thinking about, where is it safe to express this, to ask people to use this language. So again, when we're thinking about good practice and inclusive practice, how can we create those spaces where somebody feels safe to be able to express themselves, to be able to ask, what language they want people to use, such as pronouns or names or descriptive terms around their gender. And again, this is where those questions might be really important. Asking somebody, does anybody else know? Do you want me to correct somebody if they make a mistake? Because then you know whether or not you're talking about them in what way with other people. It might be that they've only told you because you feel like a safe person to talk to. And then some people might not experience a sense of gender at all. So they may describe themselves as agender. So all one word, as it says on the screen. But the other thing to remember about our experiences of gender, not just for trans people, but for anybody, is that we don't just experience our gender separately to other experiences of self. So these can all be influenced by our ethnicity, our faith, our age, our class, our education, all of these different aspects of ourselves. So for example, if somebody is trans, they're not just trans. They have other identities, other experiences that may impact on that as well. So for example, a disabled trans person may experience their gender differently because of the way people react to them or interact with them in terms of their disability as well. So if you have learning differences, for example, you might not be given as much autonomy, or if you're a younger person, you might not be given as much autonomy, and therefore you might not be believed. Same things happens around mental ill health. If you are a trans person of color, then your ethnicity or your race may play a part in that as well. So just thinking about those different intersections of experiences and recognizing that we should create space for everybody to be included and not just trans people who kind of fit into some of those defaults that we might have. And by defaults, I call them that because quite often we don't necessarily name them at first. The way that language evolves, we start to name the other, but we don't necessarily name the default because it is seen as that. It's the expectation of your experience or your identity. So those people who are white, middle-aged, middle class, without disabilities or impairments, university educated, all of those kind of defaults that we have. So making sure we listen to the experiences, the stories, the achievements of people outside of those defaults as well. And The other thing to remember is that, you know, being trans is part of the ordinary diversity of life experiences. People who have questioned or discovered their gender and understood it in different ways have existed throughout time in many, many different cultures. So it might be that people have recognized themselves to be hydra in South Asia, travesti in Portugal, Brazil, Argentina, as two-spirit in North America, as mahu in the South Pacific. These are just a couple of different terms of different genders that people have understood for hundreds and hundreds of years. And when it comes to trans experiences, although stats aren't absolute and perfect, what we're seeing coming through in the research that is available to us at the moment is 1 in around 100 people kind of bringing themselves into that broad umbrella of transgender. And it's important to recognize that it's not a mental illness. It was classed historically under mental ill health, but it's not in and of itself mental ill health. But recognizing those associated issues, pressures, can distress people to the point where they become ill. So thinking about not being able to express yourself, maybe somebody who is experiencing gender dysphoria, maybe somebody who has to then deal with the stigma that exists around trans experiences in this world. So thinking about how that can impact their health and their mental health. But I think the other important thing to remember, and one of the things that we've been celebrating over the last week, well, the week before actually, leading up to Trans Day of Remembrance in Trans Awareness Week, is trans joy, is creating a space where we can recognize that that impact on someone's mental health can also be a really positive thing as well. So just thinking about being trans doesn't automatically impact your mental health and doesn't automatically equal mental ill health, but it can impact that in both positive and negative ways. So again, giving space to create that trans joy, create space where we can laugh and just be joyous and experience ourselves. The other thing is that some trans people may know they're trans from as early as they can remember. Maybe they had language for it, maybe they didn't. And others may be questioning it or still exploring their gender for a period of time. And one of the important things to kind of think about within that is to just create space where people are able to explore that. I've been working alongside trans people now for the last 20 odd years, and I've been creating kind of social spaces both for adult groups and groups for young people. And what we've seen in those spaces is that somebody's unsure and they come along to explore their gender in these support and social spaces. Usually they come for 1, maybe 2 sessions and then realize they're not trans because they've been given that opportunity to explore it. So being able to explore it can be really important in both understanding your gender, understanding your transness, and whether that fits or not for you. And then some people might transition. And again, that can mean different things to different people. So people will relate to this in different ways as well. And that might include changing their outward appearance. That might include medical transition, social transition, emotional transition. So thinking about how they interact with the world around them that matches with their gender identity as well. So again, depending on the individual, this might look quite different. And one of the things that's really important to understand sort of trans people's experiences is to recognize that the term sex and gender can be used to describe different aspects of a person. So there are many, many different understandings of these two terms, sex and gender. There's no single answer, no one right way to understand this. Our understanding of these comes from all sorts of different places, whether that's our faith, our beliefs, our education, our cultures, our language. You know, there have been studies done around language and how that really creates the world around us, and that can really influence our understanding of gender and sex. So for example, some languages don't have 2 separate words for sex and gender. Other languages will gender people with the language that we use. So we might talk about pronouns, he, she, they. So in English, we have a gender neutral pronoun. In other languages, that might not be the case. Pronouns don't exist. Or it might be that we gender not just people, but the objects around us. I sign British Sign Language, and that is a person. We might talk about my friend, but until I start to layer it with that understanding, that cultural understanding of sex or gender, you don't know what their sex or gender is. Until maybe I talk about a role, I might talk about being a mother or a father, or I might talk about a name, or I might describe their work. And then we might sort of start to make assumptions and guesses and have some picture that we're creating around their gender. So each person's view reflects their own experience. But when we're thinking about our practice, our inclusive practice, how does that view enable inclusion for everyone? You know, one of the things that we think is that there shouldn't be a hierarchy of rights. If we look at including those who are the most marginalized in our spaces, then actually quite often when we look at the good practice to include those people, it actually creates better inclusion for much wider groups of people as well. And sex and gender are more complex than most of us are brought up to think. And most of us are brought up to think that they're the same thing. We can use those interchangeably. The way that we see them at GI is thinking about sex as being that physiological or that biological. So we might talk about chromosomes, sex hormones, secondary sex characteristics like body hair, facial hair, breast growth, voice differences. We might think about internal reproductive organs, or what have we missed out? Genitalia. So chromosomes, hormones, genitalia, internal reproductive organs, and secondary sex characteristics. And then our gender identity, thinking about our sense of self. How do we relate to that? What does that mean to us? And then how do we express that to others? And that can be very much dependent on society in terms of how that is understood or recognized in each other. And they can both be thought of as a spectrum. And so two aspects of a person that are not experienced independently of each other, although we're thinking about how they can be separated out, but also thinking about how they interact with each other as well. And it's important to recognize that our physical sex doesn't automatically determine our gender identity. And this is especially important when we're thinking about trans people and those expectations we're placing on people. So, for example, a trans person's physical sex might not automatically determine our sense of self. So we can't guess someone's gender. They might not always align as we expect. And also, there's an assumption quite often that we read someone's gender, we look at someone's physical aspects, and we make an assumption about, you know, their sex or their gender. And what's important to remember is that we can get into quite sticky situations if we are just using those physical characteristics, whether you're trans or not, to determine whether you fit into this category of man or woman, male or female. So thinking about how we create space again for everyone, when we're not reducing people just to what their physical characteristics are. I have family members who have a family member who has quite a low voice for a woman. She's often mistaken as a man on the phone. She's not trans, she's cisgender. There's a whole range of different variations of our bodies. And this again is just part of the human experience. So what we tend to find is that views that don't acknowledge this diversity tends to create these barriers, both for trans and cis people, as I say. So making sure we're not making assumptions about people and their gender based on what they look like or their physical aspects, and making sure that we're not making assumptions about someone's gender. We're not making assumptions about what somebody should be doing or wearing or looking like or be good at based on someone's gender. So going back to what we imagine in terms of imagining a world where these narrow perceptions and expectations of gender aren't limiting how we create space for people. So that, again, as we said, doesn't just benefit trans people, but wider groups of people as well. I'm going to move on to language. So when it comes to language, recognizing that there are three main types of language, it can be a concern. You know, we don't want to upset people. We don't want to cause harm. So it could be useful to think about how we approach these three main types. So first of all, we have the everyday language that we use that is gendered on an everyday basis. So that might be someone's name, their pronouns, or their title. And then we have the descriptive language, what we might sort of think of as the labels that we use to describe ourselves to ourselves or to others. And then we have ideas language, language that helps us talk about key ideas, such as, thinking about what our understanding of sex or gender is. And one of the ways to manage it is to focus on that everyday language that we use. So for an individual, that might be thinking about their name, what pronouns they use, whether a title is appropriate or not, and what title to use. But also thinking about that collective language that we use for groups of people, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen. Where we're able to, we would definitely recommend asking, find out what is right for that individual, and then use that right language, listen to what they're saying and respect that for the individual. Where we're not able to ask, then we would recommend starting with gender neutral language, creating space where we're not making assumptions about anybody's gender or the language that they use for themselves or the people around them. There's lots of gender neutral language that already exists. So we might be talking about parents, siblings, partners, people, folk, colleagues, students, pupils. There's lots and lots of gender neutral language that already exists. And this is an example of where we start to adapt language to be more inclusive of trans people. We can see that it benefits other groups of people as well. So for example, if I use the term partner, I'm creating space where I'm not making an assumption about people's gender. And therefore we're creating space for people in same-sex relationships. And also, I'm not having to guess, what's the marital status of these people depending on their age. Am I guessing that they're married and therefore using husband or wife because they're older? Am I seeing a ring and then assuming that they're married from that? Or do I use the term girlfriend or boyfriend? What language does that individual use? So if I start with gender neutral language, we can then create space to share language and the right language between us. I'm not kind of creating space where I'm then placing gender into that conversation where it might not be needed yet. And then when it comes to those descriptive terms, most of the time we don't need those in everyday interactions. When I walk into a pub, I don't say, I'll have a Coke, please. And by the way, I am trans, I'm genderqueer, non-binary, transmasculine. That descriptive term isn't needed in the everyday interaction. What is needed is going back to the everyday language above. So listen, don't make assumptions, ask if we need to, and then again, respect the language that is right for that individual. And it might be that we make mistakes. We reference so much from a point of gender. We do see people and then we make an assumption, lots of assumptions about who that person is, and one of those being their gender. If you make a mistake, don't over worry. We're not saying don't worry, we're saying don't over worry. The more you worry about it, the more likely you are to freeze or continue to make mistakes or just to not be able to communicate effectively. So don't over worry. The more you, if you do make a mistake, apologize, correct yourself and move on. And that moving on part is also really important. If you spend the rest of that interaction apologizing, it shifts. And instead of saying, I'm sorry, it becomes, I am sorry, but right now I'm feeling really bad. I'm feeling quite guilty because I know that I've upset you. So please, can you reassure me? So apologize, correct yourself and move on. So I'm just going to talk very, very quickly about legislation, and then I'm going to finish off with a few little pointers around good practice, and then we'll come to some questions, which I can see already coming into chat. So do add those in if you want to, or into the questions, sorry, not chat. So when it comes to legislation, trans people do have protection under the law. And just generally, there are three main points to think about around legislation. The first one is that in UK law, there's no space for non-binary people to exist. It's written very much within the binary. So if we're thinking about full trans inclusion, remembering those people that don't fit into that binary. So we can already see that there are some limitations there. So let's focus on that positive inclusion. Let's remember that the intent of the law was to protect and include people, and let's kind of expand that to as many people as we possibly can. The second one is the terms sex and gender are used interchangeably within the legislation. So important to think about that. And the third one is that the way that UK law is kind of created is it all gets written down, we get legislation. But it's not until it gets into the courts that we start to see people argue, you know, what does this phrase mean? What does this term mean? How are we going to interpret that certain bit there? And then we start to see case law. Because there isn't much case law around this, there is still lots of room for interpretation. I've delivered training to a group of lawyers, and there was a whole conversation in the legislation part where people were interpreting it differently in that space. So it's really important to remember that there is still sort of that space for interpretation, and people are interpreting it differently. So the main piece of legislation is the Equality Act. So this makes discrimination, so people being treated less favorably, harassment, where people are finding that there is unwanted behaviors or a space feels unsafe or hostile, and victimization, where somebody is victimized because they've stood up for their own or somebody else's rights. It makes those things unlawful, and it's based on 9 protected characteristics. The one that essentially protects trans people is called gender reassignment. And people of all ages are protected. So thinking about, you know, in school spaces, there's no kind of upper or lower age limit there. If you have the protected characteristic of gender reassignment, what it talks about is you are either proposing to, you are undergoing, or you have undergone transition in some way. And it makes it quite clear that it's a social process. You don't have to be under medical intervention. So if somebody is intending to, they're proposing to, so again, you don't have to have started that process. That's the point that we could argue that somebody is protected around this. So that very quickly is the Equality Act. In the Gender Recognition Act, so this allows somebody to change their gender on their birth certificate. That's all it does. And all it gives you the right to is to have a marriage, civil partnership, to be registered with HMRC or DWP, so taxes and pensions, to be registered in that gender. That's all it impacts on. It doesn't impact on anything else at all. So it literally allows somebody to apply for a gender recognition certificate. And once they've got that certificate, they can then change their birth certificate. And that birth certificate only impacts on those things. People have to go through quite a lengthy and costly process to be able to do that. So not many people have access to that. It's also within the binary as well. So you can only change your birth certificate to reflect male or female. You have to prove that you've lived in role for a minimum of 2 years. You have to be over 18. So there are lots of limitations within that. But what it does is allow somebody just to change that last piece of ID document. Everything else in the UK, we can just change. Passport is slightly different. We need a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria, as we do also for the Gender Recognition Act. But everything else is based on self-declaration. The idea going in, this is who I am, please can you update my records? And the Equality Act is also based on self-declaration. Other pieces of legislation might come into play, so thinking about data protection. Now, within Data Protection Act, trans people aren't explicitly included, but we know that that information is sensitive, so we would recommend that you would treat that as you would any other sensitive data, any special category data. And then also thinking about the Human Rights Act, criminal common law may also play a part in terms of trans people's rights in the UK. So as I said, there are limitations in terms of the law. Let's focus on that positive inclusion. So thinking about that good practice, I'm going to talk very specifically about young people and then some general tips to finish off. And then we've got space for those questions. So when it comes to a young trans person, the first thing to do is if they've told you that they're trans, that's something that they've shared, something really personal. So recognize and honor the trust that person has placed in you by telling you that they're trans, or that they might be exploring or questioning their gender. Let the young person take the lead, sorry. So what are their wishes? Let them set the agenda, the pace, who needs to know when, what's happening, how are they changing, what does trans mean to them, what does that mean in terms of the expectations or what's available to them. So to support them to explore those options. And as I said before, recognize that some young trans people are certain and others might be unsure and need time to explore those options. So don't expect the young person to have all of those answers. Then just thinking about safeguarding being trans isn't inherently a safeguarding matter either for the young person or their peers. So when it comes to privacy, both physical and confidentiality, telling others, just thinking about that should in most situations be done with the young person's consent. We're not saying disregard safeguarding. Safeguarding obviously exists. We can never guarantee complete confidentiality, and this is exactly the same. But just thinking about what happens if you do tell a parent or a carer, because sometimes that can lead to safeguarding issues. So one of the things I think it's important to recognize is that if someone tells you they're exploring their gender or they're trans, then it made me think, okay, let's just keep an eye out here, because there may be sort of extra risk factors in terms of safeguarding. So self-harm, suicide ideation, isolation, you know, there might be abuse from family members, there might be abuse from other peers around them. So it would make me think about that. But just thinking about if you feel that it's important to tell the parent, and I think that's always what we should be working towards, because if the person has supportive people in their life, they're more likely to thrive. Have a conversation with the young person first. Offer to support them to have the conversation. Maybe you've got a parents' evening coming up, and you might be able to offer to talk to the parents then about it, or you might need to check in and say, what name do you want me to use in this place? Also make sure, you know, that we're respecting the language that they're using, so their name, their pronouns, any other gendered language, and this may mean changing it more than once or using different names or pronouns in different spaces. And then establish ways to have those important conversations. If the young person is ready to do so, explore with them the language they use for their gender identity and their sexuality or sexual orientation, if that's appropriate. What does it mean for them? Enable exploration so they can that you have removed barriers and assumptions so that they can just be able to explore without trying to worry about how you might be thinking about this. And then support their access to gendered spaces or groups, to clothes and accessories, and other social support that may support their gender identity, if that's something that they feel is important to them. And then finally, just some top tips for you. So don't assume someone's gender. If we start with that universal language, we can find out people's choices by using that ask, listen, respect approach. And if you make a mistake, apologize, correct yourself and move on. Respect confidentiality. So making sure we're not divulging people's gendered history without their consent. Assume everyone chooses the facilities that are the best fit for them. You know, if we want to think about safety and confidentiality and privacy, then I think that's a wider conversation than just trans people. If somebody is doing something that seems inappropriate or dangerous, then it doesn't matter whether they're transgender or cisgender. You know, it doesn't matter whether they're trans or not. That's something that we should be thinking about everyone. Be kind. You don't have to understand all about trans people to be kind and respectful. When I first approached my GP about this topic, he knew absolutely nothing, but his approach was inclusive and kind and respectful, and that made a huge difference to my experience. Remember that trans people aren't just trans. So again, just remembering those intersecting identities and experiences and how they can impact on someone's either access to services or support or their experiences of gender. Educate yourself, thinking about, you know, what programs are out there, what resources are out there. After the session, we will share our resources list, which is also on the website. It's about 20 odd pages that links to lots and lots of different information and resources there. And then step forward and be counted. There are lots of conversations happening at the moment. There is looking at new service specification in terms of the NHS guidelines around accessing healthcare, especially around trans youth. We are currently responding to that consultation. That's something that anybody can do. If you want to look at our guidelines around that, then we're on all of the usual social media spaces, and you're welcome to use that as well. And be visible in your allyship. Let people know that you're inclusive, that you're supportive. If you're doing that, though, you need to make sure you're doing steps 1 to 7 first. So don't just make sure it's not tokenistic. Make sure you're doing the work to be supportive as well as being visible in your allyship. So we can see we've got some questions, so we'll come to those. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time. I'm going to leave the details on there, so if you want to get in touch with us, you can. I'm also going to pop into chat a link, which is our evaluation. So you're welcome to fill that out as well. So if you grab that from chat, and you should be able to see that. And I'm just going to have a look at the questions now. Okay, so the first question that's come through is, when using the term trans, should you use a capital letter in the same way as we do the term black? Yeah, really good question. So I generally don't capitalize it, although you will see that some people do. The reason that I don't capitalize it is because if we think about the wider acronym LGBTQIA+, we don't tend to capitalize those. So I would kind of align it more with that rather than kind of cultural or racial identity in terms of black. So we don't tend to capitalize gay or lesbian, queer, etc. So I'd kind of align it to that. I don't think there's a huge problem if you do, but it's not something that I would tend to do. Next question. What can we do to be better allies of trans people? So I think I touched on that very, very quickly in terms of some of the tips there. But I think that what can we do? I think listen to trans people is really, really important, and create space where people are, as trans people, are able to speak for themselves. So we're not speaking over on behalf of trans people is really important. As I talked about earlier, when it comes to young trans people, quite often there's, and it's the same around sexual orientation as well, historically, there's an idea that this might be a phase, or that young people don't necessarily have the same autonomy, so they might not be taken as seriously as they would if they're adults. So that listening can be really important. You know, it may well be that somebody isn't trans, or that they understand their gender in a different way. So there should be that space to explore and that flexibility, but making sure that we listen and we don't disregard that. So listen to trans people, create space for people to be able to explore. And I think the other thing at the minute is let people know that it's safe, because there's a lot of anti-trans narratives out there. We're seeing a lot of anti-trans articles in the media. We're seeing a lot of potential change in terms of access to services, healthcare. Rishi Sunak was talking about the Equality Act and changing that. There are the Gender Recognition Act reforms that are going through the Scottish Parliament at the minute, hopefully going to be more inclusive, but there is a group of people who are fighting that. So yeah, so let us know that you're an ally. So that visibility as well as doing the work is important. Thank you for that one. And then the next one that we've got in here is, so thinking about the increased visibility of trans people in the media and popular culture, for example, Drag Race. Sorry, there is increased visibility of trans people in the media and popular culture. So for example, Drag Race. But is there a risk that this could lead to an untypical perception of what it is to be trans and to stereotyping? I think the media is always going to be a risk of stereotyping, you know, not just around trans people, but we see the media impacting how we think about all sorts of different issues there. So absolutely. And I think that is why it's so important to come back to what I was talking about in terms of ensuring that there are space for trans people to share their own stories and their own experiences. And the other thing is important to recognize is that that is an individual story, an individual experience. So make sure we're not kind of looking at that story or that experience going, right, now I know all about the trans experience. You know, we're all individual, we all relate to it in different ways, as I said at the very beginning. So I think absolutely there's a risk there, as you know, we see a risk with any other experience or identity. So acknowledging that, recognizing that risk there, and that it's individual is really important. Let me just see, there's something in chat. Is that a question? Yeah, no. Are there any other questions that people have? Those are all the ones that have come through so far. But if you do have any other questions, then very happy to respond.
Hi Lee, Jennifer here.
Hi.
Hi, yeah, that was brilliant. I don't know how you got through so much in such a short amount of time, and it's fantastic. One of the things that often come up in case studies is a session you covered about young trans people, about if somebody discloses or goes to a teacher and says, you know, I got some issues about my gender identity, but my parents won't accept it. But when I'm in school, I feel like this is a safe space for me. So when I'm in school, can I be called something else? So what would the teacher have to do in that circumstances? Will they have to report it? Would there be any issues around using different pronouns to what the family have said the child should be using? Or do you just respect the wishes of the child? I'm just worried about, the teachers are worried about, I mean, you're clear when you said it's not a safeguarding issues, but that's going against the wishes of the parents in support of the child. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, this is something that's really out there at the minute. People are talking about changing the guidelines. There's conversations at the minute around both Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak talking about, that young people shouldn't be able to socially transition without parental consent. So things are getting really kind of scary, I think, for people. So one of the things to think about there is, your job is to center the young person. If you're a teacher, you're there to center the young person. So for me, that means, what are their wishes? Listening to that. And that might be, actually, my parents aren't supportive, I'm not ready to tell them yet, or I'm scared to tell them. It might not be that, the young person might not know whether they're supportive or not. They might just be scared, because of course we don't necessarily know how people are going to react. I know when I first started telling people that I was trans, there were some people who I was expecting to just take it really easily and not be a problem, and really struggled with it. And there were other people that I thought, oh, they're not going to understand, or they're not going to know what this is. And they were just like, oh yeah, no, that's cool, I understand. So we don't necessarily know how people are going to react. So for me, it comes down to, as I say, what is the young person's needs or wishes? And as I've already said, it's important to work towards creating space where the parents or the carers in that young person's life are knowing about that and are on board. And that's really important to work towards, because if they can have, allies in their lives, if their parents can be understanding and even better supportive, then that's a really important thing. We don't want to be keeping that information from them. But I think, when it comes to using a different name for the young person, different pronouns, especially different name, like, if we compare that to other experiences, if a young person came in and said, I know it says that my name is Georgina, but actually I go by George, it's unlikely that the teachers are going to contact the parents and say, oh, is it okay if I use the term George? If I call this person George instead. So nicknames, we use different names for people all of the time, and not necessarily what their official name is. So I would kind of, at the minute, treat it the same as that. If somebody comes out as gay, if somebody tells us that they are exploring a different faith system, we wouldn't automatically think that we need to tell the parents, but it might be useful for the parents to know at some point, so they can support them with that. And I think, there's the same around being trans. And sometimes that idea is, oh, we must tell the parents, sometimes comes from a place of, well, maybe this is a bad thing or a shameful thing. It's got that stigma around it. Quite often it's not, we must tell the parents so they can celebrate this wonderful thing too. So I think also think about, why is it that you think it's important for the parents to know right now? And so asking yourself those questions, talk to a young person, what are they saying? What are the safeguarding needs around that? Why do you think it's important for the parents to know? And kind of working through those as well. Oh, so another question's come through. Which country in the world has the biggest legislative framework to support trans people? So there is an organization called Transgender Europe, and they include looking at sort of this kind of information, both European and Central Asia. And there's also ILGA, which is the International Lesbian, Gay and Expanded Association. So they look at these things. One of the places that I know there's a couple of places off the top of my head that I know are really good. So Argentina and Malta have some really good legislation in place in terms of being able to change your name, being able to change your kind of legal documentation, healthcare provision, and anti-discrimination legislation as well. So those are two off the top of my head that I would say. But I think there are other little bits of really good practice in other places. And I think the other thing to remember about legislation is that just because there's amazing legislation in place doesn't mean that trans inclusion in that country is necessarily brilliant. And likewise, there might be no legislation in place, but actually trans inclusion is pretty good. So that's important to remember as well. Let's finish there, because I know we needed to finish to make sure that you have time to get through to your other pieces of today, as well as being able to get a break. But thank you so much for your time. If you want to get in touch, our details are there, so just get in touch with training@genderedintelligence.co.uk, and we'll be following up with some resources after the session as well. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lee. That was excellent and covered a lot of space and all the questions as well. I really appreciate it, and thank you to everybody for your questions. I'm sure there'll be more, so at least you've got Lee's details there if you need to get in touch after this session, and as Lee says, we'll be disseminating the materials. So thank you everyone. We're now moving on to the next session, so you can sign out now, and thank you, Lee. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks.